of course, there was one a couple years ago. We spent Christmas in Phoenix with my sister, which nothing weird happened. It's just spending Christmas in the desert just doesn't make a lot of sense. And then there was that one there was that one Christmas that when we went to the theater, we went to go see a movie on Christmas, and apparently a lot of people do that because the place was packed and the tellers just looked miserable. And so we went and we watched a movie on Christmas. I'm like, man, this is kind of weird. I'm not going to do this again. I'm gonna go rent a movie instead. And so that was kind of a weird Christmas for us. But the weirdest Christmas I think I ever experienced was a couple years ago when our family went out to Massachusetts for a white Christmas. It was pretty cool because it was snowy outside and everything was white, and it was the last time that Evie's entire family was all together. And so it was, of course, myself, Evie, and our family. It was her eldest sister and her whole family, and the middle sister and her whole family, plus her parents. And so there was, 15, 20 of us all in this one house. And because it was so snowy, we were really pretty much locked inside of the house. Which, of course, it's fun. Everyone together, cozy and together for Christmas. But something unexpected happened that just sort of hijacked all of the good feels in the family. It started off when my grandfather just got sick, and then he disappeared for about 16 hours. And then a couple hours later after that, my wife suddenly got sick, and she disappeared for about 16 hours. And one by one, there was something going around the house, picking off one person after the other. And of course, being in a house where there was a lot of snow outside and we couldn't really go anywhere, you were trapped and there was nowhere to run. And of course, you didn't want to go anywhere near the bathrooms for obvious reasons. And you couldn't really find anywhere in the house where there was solace, or where you couldn't hear someone throwing up somewhere in the house. It got really, really bad. Have you guys ever seen Contagion? Yeah, that's exactly what it felt like in this house on this winter Merry Christmas. Well, I tell you what, I've never been so paranoid in all of my life. Never been so paranoid. I was washing my hands like crazy. I was avoiding people throughout the entire trip. There was nowhere to run. I couldn't find a refuge anywhere within this house. And you know what? Day 8 happened. Day 12 happened. And finally on day 13 was the day that we were leaving. I've never been so excited to end a vacation. And I'm packing up my stuff. I'm so excited to be going home. And then all of a sudden, I don't feel so good. 2 hours before I was going to get in that car and drive off to Logan Airport and find my way home. Well, my wife and my daughter had to leave without me. As they were mid-air, I was on the floor, and I was just out. Sure enough, 16 hours, 2 days recovery time. And man, to this day, I still get PTSD whenever I hear someone coughing. To this day, I swear to you. It was just a weird Christmas. But I tell you what, after that Christmas, we laugh about it a lot, right? We laugh about it a lot. There's a lot of things that we learned from this Christmas, but weird Christmases just have a way of sticking out, and you end up learning something about yourself. You end up learning something about your family. You end up learning something about the situation, right? Tradition is good, but sometimes you just need a little bit of a weird Christmas. We are going through the Jesus Christmas story right now in Matthew chapter 2, and we're encroaching on some weird Christmas events that often don't get sung about in Christmas carols. And so we're going to be reading out of Matthew chapter 2 today, this very interesting, very weird situation that ended up happening early in Jesus' life. See, what's going to happen is that King Herod is threatened by Jesus. He hears that there is a new king in town from the Magi, and when the Magi leave, Herod is going to send in some soldiers, and he is going to try to eliminate Jesus by killing all of the boy infants throughout the entire city of Bethlehem. But before Herod gets there, God appears to Joseph in a dream. This is Jesus' dad, and says, Go and flee to Egypt and stay there until I call you out. Scholars say that Jesus was there anywhere from 1 year to 7 years, but he was there for a significant period of time where he was a refugee in Egypt until Herod died and Jesus and his family was able to be moved back. As I said, we don't really sing about this much in our Christmas carols, but we're going to be reading about it today in Matthew chapter 2, verses 13, because I believe that this passage, though it's weird, we learn a lot about the nature of God, and thus we learn a lot about ourselves. It starts off like this. After the wise men were gone, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother, the angel said. Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. That night Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary and his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, I have called my son out of Egypt. This is a weird little story within, sort of tucked away in this Christmas story. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, Matthew makes this connection between the episode, this sort of Egypt episode and the prophecy that Hosea spoke about in chapter 11 when he says, out of Egypt I have called my son. There are some inspiring events of why I think that they connected this Egypt episode with this Herod episode, but certainly there are some weird things happening here. First and foremost, Jesus and his family are fleeing to Egypt, where they'll be living there from 1 to 7 years. This is a weird event that happens. And then citing Hosea as the messianic prophecy is an unusual passage to be able to say this is the Messiah because Hosea talked about it. And we're going to be talking about why that's weird here in just a moment. But both these things tell us something about Jesus, and I believe that they tell us something about ourselves. And so we're going to be talking about the event of Egypt today, and we're also going to be talking about the prophet Hosea today, and why those two things connect, and why they matter for you and I. And so the first thing we're going to be looking at today is Egypt, and specifically how Jesus goes to Egypt to identify with the people of Egypt. Last week we talked about how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem was an insignificant village on virtually every account. They had their heyday when David was born and Samuel came into Bethlehem. Before that, it was a place of refuge for a couple other people. But for 16 generations, no one cared about Bethlehem. And this is the village that God identified. This is where your leader is going to come from. And so not only was Jesus not born in Jerusalem, but he was born in Bethlehem so that he could identify with people who are insignificant. But now Jesus is called to live a life in Egypt as someone from an illegitimate birth to a family who is now homeless, to live as an illegal alien and a refugee in a foreign land. God is really sort of layering on something really thick on here about being able to relate to the outcast. Not only is he an outcast in Israel, but now he is an outcast living in Egypt. Now, Jesus' life wasn't by accident. I believe that this is planned by God. But of course, why would God instruct Jesus to live like this? Why would God direct him to go and live with Egypt? I can only imagine how difficult it was for Mary and Joseph to understand this. They got the prophecy and said, your son will be the Messiah. And now they find themselves becoming refugees living in Egypt. See, Jesus was a Hebrew boy who was the Messiah for the Jewish people, and for every right he belonged to be in Israel. Yet, years of his adolescent life was spent as a refugee in Egypt. I imagine that must have been very, very confusing for the parents. But I imagine that some of you guys might know exactly what this feels like. There is a purpose and there is a plan, and God brings you on a detour. You find yourself living in a place or a situation that you did not expect. In every right, you didn't account for the misdirection or the rendezvous that happened within your life. And it is confusing and it is weird. I did not expect this baby to be born into my life right now. I did not expect to be fired from this job right now. I did not expect to be transferred to this job that I did not want in the first place right now. I did not expect my relationship with my spouse to be where it is right now. I did not expect my financial place to be where it is right now. And you find yourself in a place that is simply a detour of where you're supposed to be and where you have been. It feels like it's terribly out of place. You feel like you're really not going anywhere. You're just sort of in a holding pattern. And I think that this is exactly where Joseph and Mary and Jesus find themselves in. They're supposed to be living in Israel, but yet they find themselves in Egypt. But I think that in these detour moments, we can learn something about ourselves, and we can maybe learn something that God is trying to teach us about ourselves as well. You know what drives me crazy right now? It drives me absolutely bonkers and nuts, and you're probably going to think I'm silly for this. But it drives me nuts that I don't live in Burlingame. It drives me crazy. I live a half a mile on the other side of the border in San Mateo. I do all my shopping in Burlingame. I worked at a Starbucks in Burlingame. I pastor a church in Burlingame. But I don't live in Burlingame. And it drives me nuts. Because if I'm going to pastor this city, I got to be in this city. But I know that God opened up an incredible opportunity, and there's an apartment that we love at a price that we can afford. And so I'm thankful to live in this place. And you know what? I'm not saying that God didn't bring me to this place, just like God didn't bring Jesus into Egypt. But it is certainly a detour that there is a tension within us that says, God, how are you going to redeem this for good? Because quite frankly, it's driving me nuts that I'm living where I'm living. Just this past Friday, there was a holiday parade here in Burlingame, and I was walking downtown, and I was looking at all the faces, and I just got this Holy Spirit grip on the inside of me that said, these are your people. You don't know them. Drives me crazy. Drives me bonkers. Drives me mad. But I think there's a holy discontentment that we can learn from this. Is that sometimes God brings us on detours to teach us something. And I believe that in this detour to Egypt, Jesus learned something that was vital in his ministry. I wonder, as Jesus' time in Egypt as a refugee, as an outsider, how it affected his ministry. I wonder if he would have stopped at the well and talked to the foreign woman if he had not been a foreigner himself. Would Jesus have shown compassion for the woman who was caught in adultery, being of a illegitimate birth himself? I'm sure that he witnessed his mother being treated cruelly and being treated in judgment. And I wonder that living sort of an illegitimate child life, if he had been shown extra compassion for this woman because maybe he saw his mother within that adultery, or that woman who was caught in adultery. I wonder how his time as refugee, his time as an outsider, his time in Egypt, even though he didn't belong, he learned something that would affect his life in Egypt. And I believe that I am learning something about myself, and I'm learning something about this city because I'm able to live outside of it for a while, even though I know that this is where I belong. Sometimes God brings us on detours to teach us something about ourselves. Jesus was a Hebrew boy who was the Messiah for the Jewish people, and he belonged in Israel. Yet, out of Egypt I will call my son was important to God. It was important enough for God. And I believe that Jesus' ministry was richer because of the rendezvous that he was called into. I was talking about weird Christmases earlier, and one of my most memorable Christmases was a Christmas I was in second grade, and I didn't understand really what was happening, but we went to a post office, and my dad I remember it as a post office, and we went to one of the tellers, and the teller gave my dad an envelope full of colorful money, almost like Monopoly money, and he took it, and he went home, and I remember him giving it to my mom, and there was both disgrace and joy on their faces at the same time. And what I learned later was that envelope full of colorful money was food stamps. My family was on food stamps. I guess my dad was a pastor of a small church, and they were unable to pay him for several months, and so because of that, he was able to go and apply for food stamps, and that's what we had that Christmas. We had food stamps. And so I remember going to our local grocery store, and I remember my mom saying, okay, go pick out something to buy for your sister for Christmas. So I got her the cookie cereals, like the Cookie Crisps, and I was jacked because I got the all-berry Kicks, and I was stoked about that. And sure enough, that winter we cut down our own Christmas tree, and we literally made our ornaments out of cereal, not because it was DIY, but it was all that we had. Like, we cut down our own Christmas tree out of our backyard because it didn't cost anything. And we ended up making all of our ornaments ourselves because that's what was at the grocery store. Nowadays, you get like an EBIT card, and so it's a little bit more discreet. But I remember looking up at my mom. I'm full of joy because I got this sugary cereal that I'm never allowed to have. And my mom, with a little bit of disgrace, begins to pull out the colorful money and putting it on the counter for the teller to begin to take. And so I remember that feeling through my mom. And it doesn't make sense. My dad's a great pastor, a great communicator, but for this season, he just couldn't provide for our family. And so now, I like to think that that experience I had for that one Christmas enables me to empathize or relate to other people when they're having a difficult Christmas. And maybe that's why I get such a kick out of giving people money. Maybe that's why I get such a kick out of just passing it forward. Because I know what it's like to be in need. I know what it's like to not have enough. I know what it's like to have that disgraced feeling in yourself when you're like, man, I can't provide. I'm trying my hardest, but it's just not adding up right now. I think those detours that we often resent are important in building our worldview, our ministry, and it helps us begin to relate to one another maybe just a little bit better. Egypt experience, it's weird, but it's still redemptive. Now, Matthew also does something weird within this little story, is that Matthew uses a Hosea passage in order to say, this is how we know Jesus is the Christ, because of this Hosea passage in Hosea chapter 11, verses 1. And this is really weird. But one thing that we can learn from this is that God uses a Hosea passage to tell us that this is a Hosea moment. As we learned about last week, Matthew communicates a lot by what he doesn't say. And so this is one of those times in which we learn a lot about Matthew, specifically because of what he doesn't communicate. See, there's better passages, I think, that Matthew could have used to say, this is how we know this is the Messiah. Because obviously Jesus is going as a refugee to Egypt. This is a common theme throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. Abraham escaped to Egypt for refuge. Jacob escaped Egypt for refuge. Joseph's 11 brothers met him in Egypt and joined him in refuge. And any of these stories would have been a better comparison for what Jesus was going through within this moment. But Matthew doesn't point to any of these faithful patriarchs within Israel, Abraham, Jacob, or Joseph. He doesn't point to them at all. Instead, he points to the prophet Hosea. This is the difference between Jesus being associated with the dignity of his forefathers and Jesus being associated with the compassionate suffering of Israel, or of Hosea. And if you don't know anything about Hosea, once again, I don't blame you, because it's a really weird book. Hosea is one of the small prophets, and he writes in first person. And the story of Hosea is definitely an interesting one. It's about a prophet who is instructed by God to marry a prostitute named Gomer. God warns Hosea that Gomer is going to be unfaithful to him, but I want you to marry her anyway. And so the honorable prophet Hosea goes and marries a woman that he knows is going to be unfaithful to her. I imagine at the beginning of their marriage, was really fun. She felt redeemed, and, it was nice to feel the real validation of love, but something began to creep up in her, maybe, memories of something past. Maybe she wanted a little bit more adventure, or maybe there was just something within her that she just simply couldn't kick. And so she found herself inching back into her old lifestyle, inching back into prostitution, inching back into being unfaithful. The Bible said that she was being whorish in her actions. I can't imagine what Hosea must be feeling. Walking into a marriage knowing that you're going to be cheated on, and then sure enough, you're cheated on. And then in Hosea chapter 3, I imagine he's saying, I just got to leave this woman for good. But in Hosea chapter 3, God has a conversation with Hosea and says, I want you to go and redeem Gomer. And so Hosea walks into the brothel, the pimp house, and buys his wife back from the pimp and brings her home. Merry Christmas! And this is the prophet that Matthew connects to this Egypt story. A half of a verse where Hosea says, so out of Egypt I call my son. Abraham, Jacob, Joseph. Any one of these characters would have been a much more appropriate connection for Matthew to begin to make this messianic connection with. But I think that we can learn something that Matthew is trying to communicate for us in this moment. Because God is using this Hosea passage to tell us that this is in fact a Hosea moment. This passage in Hosea reminds us of God's compassionate suffering. Out of Egypt I have called my son. This brings to mind the heart of God for us all, his passion, his tenderness, and his care. Later on in chapter 11, after he says, I have called my child out of Egypt, he begins to go on and say, how in the world, how can I give up on you? You continue to run for me as I run towards you, but how can I give up? And it occurs to me that Hosea is probably the perfect picture of the Christmas story. Because how can I ever give up on you? If you don't get the illustration here, we are the unfaithful spouse. And he is the one that is now buying us out of our own darkness, buying us out of our own sin, buying us out of our old habits. And just appropriately, he's saying, I am calling you out of Egypt. I am calling you out of your darkness. I am calling you out of your own self. I'm calling you out of that situation. And so I imagine that it's a pretty appropriate, though twisted, that Matthew would look at Hosea and say, this is how this fulfills this messianic prophecy. It's a weird Christmas story that we got going on here. A detour to Egypt, spending Christmas in a desert, and referring to Hosea as saying this is the messianic promise that we've been waiting for. But the big point that we can learn from this is that a measure of love is how far you're willing to go for it and how long you're willing to wait for it. And in this passage, we learn from God that God is willing to go all the way to Egypt, and he is willing to outwait Gomer. Because in both of these situations, in both the Egypt story and in the Hosea story, it's about redeeming people. It's about redeeming us. It's about going to the furthest edge of the cliff and then jumping off a little bit so that you and I could find redemption. The story of the birth of Jesus is painted with great themes of God. The calling for Jesus from Egypt is a prophetic hint of the importance of redemption. Redemption that Jesus himself would bring out. And out of Egypt is the picture of redemption. Redemption tells us that we are in a mess and we cannot get out of it by ourselves. It doesn't matter how hard you try or muster up love in your heart, or how much you try to meditate or find peace on it in the midst of stress. It doesn't matter how healthy you eat or how much you exercise. These disciplines cannot bring you over the top in terms of your spirit. These things are helpful, but they ignore the greater problem, the greater fact of sin. Though most people try to ignore it, the story of Jesus points to the human need for a Savior who can redeem us. We are people out of place. We are born for high things, but we live for low things. We are like kings living in garbage filled with trash. We often remark on how bad things are getting, but I wonder if things have always been this bad because people have always been bad. Higher and lower natures are at war within us. Good and evil is clashing, and we are the prime examples that we need to be called out of Egypt because we need to be called out from ourselves. We are living in Egypt, and we are full of a Gomer spirit. And Egypt and Hosea are an appropriate image for us, that Jesus fulfills our need for redemption. And I think that that's what Colossians is talking about in chapter 1, where he says, "For he has rescued us from the kingdom of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his dear Son, who purchased our freedom and forgave our sins." And so while Jesus found himself on a detour to Egypt, and he found himself being entered into a Hosea sort of picture, we can find comfort and we can find hope. We can be reminded and encouraged that we have a God who doesn't give up, that goes to the edge of the cliff, that goes all the way to Egypt, and will outwait our unfaithfulness so that we could be ultimately redeemed because of Jesus' plan and his story. It's a weird story, but it's good. Will you stand with me?